Okay. So, welcome to everybody. This is actually my first time doing this exact training. I hope you like it, but whatever you feedback you do have, I would love your feedback afterwards because I'm all about making these things better. As Alicia mentioned a few minutes ago, this is going to be part one in a series. The purpose is to give your committee technical assistance and training that maybe when people are providers joining committees, they've maybe had those introductions and they've had that training at their agencies. And so this gives an opportunity for you to level the playing field. And because the committee, not that it's necessarily new, but it is in its infancy stages, it is really important to get kind of an idea, I think, like an orientation to just how to do committee work, how to work together as a group. So that's what the purpose of the next bunch of trainings is. So I'm going to start by introducing myself. My name is Allison Belcauso-Behrens. I am the program manager for the Sexual Health Center of Morristown Medical Center. We work with people who identify as LGBTQ plus. We work with people who are living with HIV. We work with a lot of sexual minorities. We work with people in the community who are often disadvantaged and vulnerable, and do a lot of work in connecting people to resources. And that's kind of how I started getting involved in housing and homelessness in the first place. So I have been part of the COC in some capacity for about the past 8 years. I've been on the data quality committee. Excuse me. I've been in the community assistance services committee, and kind of coordinated entry, a lot of the parts of the system. I do not know everything. There is no way to know everything. It is a complicated system, but I do know a lot. So if you have any questions, I would be happy to either answer you or refer you elsewhere. Today, I'm going to give a little introduction. Again, kind of talk about the project overall. And then we're going to go into some really basic stuff just about before you even start group work, what does group work look like? So we're going to talk about creating a safe space. What is a safe space and how to do that? We're going to talk about rule setting, and I'll give you a big handful of rules that I have seen work in other settings. You do not have to adopt all of them. I think in a couple of weeks, you're going to have a meeting without me where you guys start to do some of that rule setting on your own. This is your group. It's not mine. So I will step back from what those rules actually are. But the rules will really govern how you guys interact together. And then we'll talk about team building and its relationship to committee work. And then we'll do a little conclusion. So again, the goal of the next several weeks of training is to provide education and support to the advisory board. The purpose is to help members learn best practices for participation in committee work. Today's topic includes the basics of how to establish a safe space and a productive setting to engage in group work. So let's start first about talking about creating a safe space. I'm going to play this video. Let's see how we do. Let me know if it works.
So the phrase safe space, we probably have all heard it. I can say for me, safe space was used a lot in academia and on campuses. A lot of times when we would talk about issues related to identity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, one of the first guidelines before a meeting will start or before a dialogue will start was, let's create a safe space. And I think it's important first for us to unpack sort of where this terminology comes from and how we might be using it differently than what it was intended to be used as. So according to what I've learned over time is that the phrase safe space was a lot of times used within women's movement, meaning a lot of people who identified as a woman or as women said, how do we create safe spaces? Meaning, how do we create spaces where we can speak our truths, where we feel like we're not being shut down, and really even just like physical safety. So, a lot of times, safe space alluded to being in a space where you didn't feel like you would be physically hurt or harassed, especially because that was a common thing that happened to you if you were part of a identity group that has been historically and presently marginalized. What we now see is that the phrase safe space is being used to also talk about not being uncomfortable. And it's really important to recognize that when we're having difficult conversations, especially those conversations that are emotionally charged in the workplace, we can't necessarily guarantee safe space in that regards. So how I might react to a certain topic or even me sharing my personal experiences, no one can really hold my emotions or guarantee that I will feel okay in terms of how I'm interpreting a certain situation. What can be guaranteed is safe spaces in that no one is harassed because of their identities. No one feels like they don't belong. So whether they're consciously or unconsciously being picked on, or whether there's some biases that are showing up, that's really where that term is alluding to. So, what I like to say is, how do we create brave spaces? Meaning that if we're having conversations that are emotionally charged or that are connected to our identities, how do we create that space to say, okay, this is going to be hard and this is going to be uncomfortable, but we're not going to create, allow any hate speech or any type of language that will intentionally negatively impact someone, but we will make sure that we can create other guidelines to say, hey, you just said this and this is how it felt. And how do we create that dialogue in that brave space that we have? So hopefully that was helpful, and I'd love to hear more about how you all are defining safe space or brave space, or perhaps any other terminology or phrases that you're using while having some of these difficult conversations in the workplace.
So, so, I love that video, and I think it's really, really important. And again, this is why we talk about rule setting too in the same conversation, is because having boundaries and clear rules around interactions in a group setting is some of the is the most important ways, the key way that we can create a safe space. And I think it's also really important to sorry, I'm like trying to get rid of this. Okay. It's also really important to, as she mentioned, make a distinction between feeling unsafe and feeling uncomfortable. So, when we talk about creating a safe space, we're talking about having physical safety and psychological safety, meaning that you might feel uncomfortable, but no one is attacking you, that you can go into the space feeling free, um, that you're going to experience freedom from speech or actions that are going to intentionally harm you. Okay. Um, so, what are some characteristics of a safe space? So I kind of did this like 3A approach. So the first I think is your attitude. So when you're in a group setting, you are both a participant, right? Like you are an actor in the space, and you're also a receiver, right? You're also receiving information. So when you're in both roles, it's really important to have an open attitude, right? Thinking about When you're hearing information, am I open to receiving this information? When I'm sharing information, um, you want to walk that line, that boundary between sharing and oversharing, right? But being transparent and direct in your attitude, and honesty, saying to yourself, um, was that, maybe that was not the right way to say that. Maybe I should be apologizing, right? Being honest with yourself, um, and um, and honest in your speech, and also being sincere. So again, being real um, is a huge part of, people know when you're not being real with them. So being real with people um, is an important part of that attitude piece. Excuse me. Excuse me. And then your actions. So lead by example. And so, like, I always, sort of, I have an 8-year-old. And so a lot of our conversations are around like when people are doing things that seem uncomfortable for you. If you, right, like everybody sometimes looks to other people. Should I be doing that? Should I say that? Right. If you have good intentions and you're leading by example, meaning that your behaviors match the values of the organization, in this case, the organization being the advisory board committee. If your actions are matching those values, other people will follow. I mentioned apologies before, and actually our next meeting, we will talk about apologies. But it's really important to, when you make a mistake, when you overstep, when you misstep, not only to recognize that honestly, but also to take accountability and apologize. We're going to talk about what good apologies look like too. I also think it's really important to assume good intentions. I think a lot of times when somebody does something, they react or they behave a certain way or they say something, we interpret that. It goes through a lens, and like it's like a thing happens and we have a thought about that thing, and then we have a feeling in response to that thought. So if somebody kind of is nasty to you, right, in a group setting, your first thought might be, what did I do? Right? What is my, like, why? And then your feeling and reaction might be anger or resentment. Instead, I want us to have that lens be assuming good intentions. So you might have an immediate thought, whoa, right? My hackles are raised. That next thought should be, wait a second, let me not take this personally. Maybe that person was triggered, right? Or maybe they meant that in a different way, or maybe they thought this was happening and it's really that. And so taking that information and kind of reinterpreting it, assuming good intentions. And I don't mean necessarily that you shouldn't have boundaries with people that are continuously putting you down or things like that. Like, again, that's where we talk about a safe space. Is like, we want to make sure that people aren't being harassed or bullied. So I'm not saying people have permission to speak to you in a way that hurts your feelings persistently, right? Chronically. That's where rule setting comes in. But in group work, you're with other people, there's bound to be some disagreements, there's bound to be conflict. And so as long as everybody comes to the table saying, we're all here for the same reason, I'm going to really assume that that person had good intentions when they said that thing or they did that thing. The next piece is the acknowledgement. So you want to acknowledge the contributions of others. I think It's really easy for us to see sometimes where other people are failing. And group work stalls when there's blame happening. So reframing in a positive way and finding the things that people are doing that are really positive is a really important piece of moving the needle forward. I have a lot more slides left. Acknowledging discomfort. So we talked about before, like, safe space doesn't mean you're not uncomfortable. Stuff comes up, and we need to be able to deal with that discomfort. So one of the things I always tell my staff is you got to get comfortable with discomfort. You just have to accept it as part of life, right? Discomfort, you're not always going to feel comfortable. And it's in those moments of discomfort where we learn and grow. So those moments of discomfort are opportunities. They're really actually good things. So when you feel uncomfortable, I apologize. When you feel uncomfortable, again, think about that and reinterpret it. Okay, I feel uncomfortable. Let me challenge myself. Why am I feeling uncomfortable right now? And really go back to that open, honest, and sincere attitude. And then we also want to acknowledge our bias. And it doesn't mean we have to tell everybody in the ways that we're biased all the time. It means that you're acknowledging it to yourself. And I actually have a good video on unconscious bias, and hopefully it will allow me to recover my my voice a little bit while we're watching this. It's a few minutes. I think it's like maybe between 5 and 7 minutes. So it's a little bit of a longer video, but it explains a little bit more what unconscious bias is. And then we can talk about it afterwards.
The unconscious mind is amazing. It can process vastly more information than our conscious mind by using shortcuts based on our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences to make almost instantaneous decisions about everything around us. The snag is, it's wrong quite a lot of the time, especially on matters that need rational thinking. Here's a classic example. A bat and a ball cost £1 10 pence. If the bat costs £1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Most people, including over 50% of students at some of the world's leading universities, get the answer wrong and say 10 pence. The answer is actually 5 pence. Many of us choose 10 pence without thinking. This is because our unconscious mind uses instinct, not analysis. So our unconscious is fallible. It's also biased. It makes snap judgments of people we meet, categorizing them according to gender, social and other characteristics. In milliseconds, we judge whether somebody is like us and belongs to our in-group. These are the people we favor. So men might favor men, while women might favor women. However, we can belong to different in-groups, and we like to be part of an in-group that's powerful, which could mean a woman favoring a man over a woman. That's unconscious bias. All of us have it, and it colors our decisions without our realizing. For example, research reveals that if I were a man, you would be more likely to be nodding in agreement right now because people pay more attention to a male voice. The Royal Society fosters excellence in science, but this can only be achieved if we select from the widest range of talent. And that's not possible if unconscious bias is narrowing down the field for non-scientific reasons. To lessen the impact of unconscious bias, which is easier for us to notice in others, we are raising the awareness of unconscious bias to members of our selection and appointment panels. We're encouraging panel members to deliberately slow down decision-making, reconsider reasons for decisions, question cultural stereotypes, and monitor each other for unconscious bias. We can't cure unconscious bias, but with self-awareness, we can address it.
So I should have mentioned that this is a British video, and I actually don't know what a pence is and could not figure out what she was talking about at the beginning. But I thought the rest of the video was really, really useful. And what I like about it is, excuse me, I don't know what exactly the group that that this training is, this particular video is about, but it really talks about group work. I think one of the things that happens is when people want to be advocates, they join a group or a committee, right, an advocacy organization, and they're looking for change to happen quickly. And I think the important thing to remember about committee work is it actually happens more slowly than you want it to. And the reasons are because you do need to really think through consequences and things like that. And what this video is talking about is they actually want us to be slow and methodical. They want us to challenge our bias. They want us to reconsider the way things have always been done. Right? Did you see that sign? Like, this is the way we've always done it, right? So instead of making quick decisions based on what we've always done, we can take a moment to acknowledge our unconscious bias, bring that up to the front and say, why am I thinking this way? Is it because I've been trained to think this way? Is it because the dominant power in the culture is leading me in this direction, right? And so really paying attention to those things. And I think it is important to, I think, I don't know, I really found it very powerful, the cards, right? Sometimes a woman might, even though they're, you would think that they would side with other women because they want to be part of a dominant group. Sometimes women side with the dominant group, even when it's not in their best interests. And that's an example, a gendered example, but we have lots of examples of that that affect race, people of different races and different cultures throughout history as well. So really being mindful that just because you're part of a disenfranchised group doesn't actually mean you're always siding with what's best for them, and understanding why that might be. Okay. So we're going to move on out of the safe space conversation and into the rule setting conversation. And as I mentioned, they really are integrated conversations. First, I'm going to sip my tea. Okay. So they are integrated conversations because in order to create a safe space, you need to have boundaries and rules that everybody agrees to. Sometimes people call this a community agreement. And you can even, after you adapt your rules, you choose your rules, you can have people when they come into the group for the first time, kind of review the rules, or you could do it at the beginning of every meeting, is these are our rules, just go over them again, and just have everybody verbally agree to the rules. So I have another video. Again, I often feel, and I guess I probably didn't say this to me, other people, I'm not going to duplicate work, right? Other people have done this work and they've done a really good job with it. So I'm not going to repeat things or steal things or whatever, like this is really good stuff. So I'm going to play this other video. Now, these are some examples of important rules that you can set to create that safe space.
I'm talking about a specific tool that's available on my website, sassycooperates.org. And for those of you following along from the blog post or from my tool library, this is the tool that I'll be talking about. So you can go ahead, download it, print it out, and then follow along at home. But I have the basic principles up here, and I'm going to walk you through setting up Safe Space today, just because it might help to see someone do it. So you and me are going to set up Safe Space right now, and let's go through those principles together. When would you want to set up Safe Space? Well, anytime you want to have a high-stakes conversation, or you might have a high-stakes conversation. So I have this tool set up with my coworkers, with clients of mine, boards of directors, working groups. I have it set up with my wife, with my mother. Ooh, did that help? Any situation where you might get real, you might want to have some ground rules for how to do that. And Safe Space is the ground rules that I've put together and that I use to make my life very productive and low on drama. So we're going to go through how to set that up today. First off, let's go through the principles. First off, we have equalize the space. What does that mean? Well, we break that down. Confidentiality is the first one. A space where you know the details and the content of your sharing isn't going to be shared outside that space is one into which you can share honestly. So we want to share lessons and outcomes, but not identifying details. That's the line between productive talk and gossiping. 2, challenge our practices. Everyone's learned their behaviors. That means we can unlearn behaviors that no longer serve us. So when we challenge each other, let's challenge our behaviors and our practices, not our innate personhood or our identities. That's not going to get us very far. So let's challenge our behaviors, not our persons. 3, make space, take space. If you're a person who, for example, likes to talk and feels pretty comfortable speaking their voice, try stepping back out of that space and see what happens. If you're a person who holds the wall a little bit, maybe doesn't speak up as much, try taking a risk and speaking up. Odds are you're voicing something not just for you, but for someone else in the room. So practice stepping out of your pattern. And lastly, equal worth. This one can be hard, but it means that your truth and my truth and everyone's truth in this conversation is equally worthy of being true. Doesn't mean they're all simultaneously true with a capital T, but my truth is just as worthy as your truth from our perspective, and we're going to honor that as we move forward together. So that's equalize the space, first principle. Second principle, check your assumptions. At the door, we do not need them. They are not helpful to us. What does that actually mean though? Well, first it means no judgments. Don't judge each other, pretty basic. It also means no self-judgments. Those of us who have been socialized or oppressed to be certain unvoiced kinds of ourselves can have a lot of trouble actually speaking up without disclaiming our knowledge. So if you say things like, I feel kind of stupid about this, or this may be a really dumb question, but you're just not only judging what's coming out of your mouth, you've normalized that judgment is something we do between ourselves. So don't judge each other and don't judge yourself. 2, everyone's an individual, not a representative of an entire group, right? I am sassy and I have pink hair. The pink-haired agenda is not the core of my day. I'm not always going to vote and act according to the pink-haired homogenized thing. However, I am sassy and I have pink hair. I am a representative of an identity and a person in my own self. I statements. Use I statements. The purpose of an I statement, which would be I feel X when you behave Y, is to own your knowledge, to personalize it and not project your knowledge or any knowing onto somebody else. That helps you really see where you're coming from and where someone else is coming from. So use your I statements and be careful of those you statements. And lastly, believe in our common best intentions. If we're sitting down to have a conversation, odds are we're not here to be a jerk. We're probably here to do something well together. So even when we differ and disagree, let's remember that we're all here to do something better. We have a common intention in best intent. So let's remember that. Now, principle 3, those first 2 principles, that's a lot of hippie kumbaya shit. Not always happens that we're our best self. We're not always at the top of our game. So how do we deal with that? Well, we acknowledge that we both have the right to be human. So we call that the right to be human. First off, we respect it. We give each other a little bit of social credit. If you come at me with maybe a little more energy than I sent at you, maybe you're having a bad day. I'll give you a little line of social credit with the expectation that when I'm having a human day, you'll give me that line back. So we float on a common sea of social credit that we agree to give each other because we get it. We're all human. Secondly, we acknowledge emotions appropriately. Is a board meeting where you're doing your finances the most appropriate space for a giant emotional conversation? Perhaps not. But emotions are inherent in every decision or human interactions we do, and we need to manage and acknowledge those. So acknowledge them. Make space for them appropriately. We honor our differences. We have a hell of a lot of homogeneities and a hell of a lot of diversities inherent in any interaction that we're going for. So we want to make sure that we always honor those differences, we never flatten them, and that we center them when it's appropriate to do so, to act in best interest and bestness to our interaction and our community. And fourth, we practice forgiveness. We practice being the bigger person and letting it go, because that is not only powerful for ourselves, but it's really, really powerful for what we're trying to do here together. The Dalai Lama says it's a great idea. He's smarter than me, and I'm gonna go with it because it's a really, really powerful force multiplier to become the bigger person. So we practice forgiveness when possible. And then the last thing, principle 4, is the nuts and bolts of consensual dialogue. These is things like active listening. There's a lot of tutorials on how to build your active listening skills. It's about taking a risk, but always knowing that everyone has a right to pass. Like, take a risk, say that thing you're scared of, but never, never, never coerce someone into giving you an answer. A coerced answer is not a sincere answer, and that's bad data that we just don't need. We also want to make sure that silence is okay. That is saying that every one of us has a different kind of communication style. Some of us are really fast, some of us are slower, and every processing speed is fine. How do we do that, deal with that in a conversation where we may not know the other person's style? We mix it up. We let there be pauses. We sometimes go fast. We ask around. We try and change it up so that we hit a diversity of styles when we're communicating, and so we don't accidentally exclude someone because of their style. And lastly, the 50% rule. This says that you and me, every party to a situation and a conversation, has an equal stake in both the problems presented and the solutions generated. It says we're all in it together. If you want to speak up for a problem, you need to speak up for a solution. And if you've got a solution, you need to be on board with defining that problem. It's a way to say that we all share in the work of making this work together, and we have an equal stake and equal skin in the game. So all of that together, big set of ground rules, principles, how we apply them, and how much we apply each one of them depending on the circumstance or conversation we're having, all of that is safe space. And now that we've set that up pretty in depth, anytime we run into each other in a grocery store, in a social justice meeting, or in a boardroom, we're going to be able to drop into a level of talking about real shit with real ground rules that'll keep the space really safe. And I hope that that tool makes sense to you. If you have questions, if you want to give me feedback, which I incorporate into various iterations of this tool, it's a living document and it really moves forward as we test it in the community. If you have any questions or feedback, go ahead and contact me through my website, sassycooperates.org, and I will talk shop with you as soon as possible. Have a great and safe day.
So for some reason that video started at 10 seconds, so I didn't.
Hey folks, this is Kate Sassoon, or Sassy, and I'm here with you today to help walk you through setting up safe space. When I say safe space, I'm talking about a specific tool that's available.
So I just wanted to make sure I had her do her introduction because for some reason it started at 10 seconds. So, but I didn't want to disrupt the video once it was going.
Available on my website.
Okay. So I have been in a great wide number of trainings, and I have led a great number of trainings and meetings throughout the course of my life. As I mentioned, I work in sexual health. So a lot of our trainings and a lot of our committees and group conversations actually are centralized around some really sensitive themes that come with a great deal of shame and stigma. So because of that, I've always been sensitive to this rule setting. It really is important to have those kinds of boundaries right from the beginning, because if you say something, it can really trigger people sometimes in meetings. And I think that this is an example of the advisory board is an example of a place that can be have sensitive topics associated with it. So I'm going to go through these. As I mentioned before, these are not rules that you need to have, but they are examples of rules that I have seen before. So I'm going to go through them for y'all. I think in the last couple of videos, you've seen there's a lot around confidentiality. So the first example of a rule is the Vegas rule. What's interesting about the Vegas rule when it comes to meetings and trainings and things like that is everybody knows the Vegas rule, right? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But when you're in a meeting or a training, there's an extra piece of that. So this rule is whatever happens here, like whatever is said here stays here. Whatever is learned here leaves here. So you can learn and you can take that with you when you go without sharing specific details of people's lives or what they shared in the meeting. The next couple of rules are around ownership. So I language. So being really clear, instead of saying you did this, saying I feel when you speak to me that way, that I'm feeling disrespected, right? And so really making sure you're taking ownership of what you're doing and what your feelings and what your behaviors are, instead of pointing fingers and laying blame. Be the crew, not the passenger. So basically what that means is, when you're working in a group setting, when you're a team, you're supposed to be all working together, which means you all should be having a shared sense of ownership over what's happening. If you're a passenger, you're just being brought along for the ride. So own, even if you're not the chair, even if you're not a secretary or whatever, you can still take ownership over the process. Make space. So I think Sassy said make space, take space, right? So make space. So an example of a make space rule is share the air. Sometimes people also have like a 3x3 rule. After you share, you should wait for 3 more people to share, or for 3 minutes, right? So it's you're not just taking up all of that space. Stay relevant. So an example of a rule for this would be a community garden or a parking lot. Basically what that means is if you're having a conversation, like let's say something's on the agenda and you're having that conversation and somebody starts to bring up a point that might be important, but it's not really relevant, right? Like they're kind of going off. We can say, oh, you know what? Alicia, I'm going to pick on Alicia. Alicia, could we put that in the community garden, plant a seed and let it grow? I actually like that metaphor a lot better than the parking lot, which is just like, we're going to put that in parking lot. It's going to sit there for a little while when we'll, take it out, bring that car around when it's time. Right. And so a community garden or a parking lot is a place to store ideas that aren't relevant in the moment, but maybe we want to come back to. So maybe we'll put them on a future agenda. So the next group of rules is around maintaining focus. So the windshield rule is like, like if some flies are hitting the windshield, you want to wipe them off, right? And so if things that maybe they're not relevant and they don't belong in the parking lot, they're just kind of getting in your way. Let's you know what, guys? Let's windshield wipe that and let's move on. The next one is wait, right? So say, wait, why am I talking? Right? So if you're starting to get off topic and you have an opportunity to like think to yourself, I have literally been mid-sentence and been like, wait a second, never mind. Where I was going is taking us so far out of the way that it's like it's not conducive to continuing this conversation. I'm going to stop that thought. And I'm going to go back to what we were talking about a minute ago. Like, even if you're in the middle of the sentence, honestly, you don't have to finish that sentence if you realize in the middle of the sentence, oh gosh, that's not a good place. So if you do a wait, why am I talking? And the next one is Elmo. And so that's when anybody else can say to you, all right, like maybe 2 people are having a conversation back and forth, it's gotten out of control. And then somebody says, you know what, let's Elmo this. All right. And Elmo is enough. Let's move on, right? Like when you're talking it into the ground and no one's getting anywhere, you're talking in circles. Have you ever been in a conversation like that? You're going to Elmo that. The next couple of rules are around respect. So the first one is tackle problems, not people. Excuse me. As you can imagine, what this is about is like if something's coming up, like let's say a person is sharing a perspective or an opinion or a problem, you're going to zero in on the problem, not the person who's sharing it. The other one is, if anybody knows the prayer of St. Francis, right? Seek first to understand, not to be understood. We're going to talk about communication next time. And a big piece of communication is listening, active listening in particular. So you're going to focus on listening, active listening, really understanding, not necessarily so much about preaching your own views. And there will be a chance for you to do both, right? But before you interrupt, before you use that unconscious bias, right? Really stop and think about, where's this person coming from? Let's really understand their point of view. Right, so this is the last rule setting slide. The next three are about growth mindset. So a growth mindset, the first rule is strong opinions, loosely held. So what that means is that you can have strong opinions, but if somebody's challenging that, don't be stubborn. They might have a good point, right? And by the way, there have been lots of conversations I've had where people had lots of good points, and I walked away from that conversation thinking to myself, they had lots of good points, but I still believe what I believed before I walked into that conversation. It doesn't necessarily mean you let your opinions go. It more just means that you're going to be willing to let your opinions go. Getting started is more important than being right. So this is about learning and moving forward and progressing, especially with committee work. You can really get bogged down in the desire to be right. So often, something I do is I say, you know what, let's just do it. Let's give it a try. Let's pilot this for 3 weeks. Let's pilot this for 2 months, right? Something like that. Let's just try it. And you know what, if it doesn't work out, there's no like, see, I told you, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're right. What you do is you learn from that experience. The next one is the donut rule. So don't get focused on that donut hole, right? Look at the big picture. The next one is about managing conflict. So tolerate and teach, don't shame and blame. Again, this is a lot about like, we're not picking on the person. It's not about what they did or who they, or what they said. If somebody says something and like, let's say maybe they made an assumption and they shared that assumption and you're like, oh, that maybe was racist, like in your mind, right? So like how many times that's okay. So like race is such a touchy topic. You would be like, that was racist, right? Because what happens when you call people racist? They don't like that. Nobody likes being called racist, even if we all are, right? At the end of the day, nobody likes that, right? And it's very shame and blame. So we might approach that differently. Actually, Alicia, I'm going to pick on you again. Actually, Alicia, I learned that X, Y, and Z in the past. And I think it might be important to remember that lesson, right? And so coming at people without no finger pointing, just redirecting. And then the last is about self-care. And so you may have many ways of many rules related to self-care, but one of the most important is having boundaries. Really knowing when to walk away from a conversation. If you feel like you're getting agitated, saying, I can't have this conversation now. I'm recognizing signs in myself that I'm feeling triggered and I'm getting overwhelmed. And I think we need to circle back around to this another time when I'm feeling better. That's totally okay. It's totally okay. And it's self-care. Self-care is about after you leave a meeting, not carrying it with you till the next meeting. Right? You may have some action items that you need to work on in between meetings, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to perseverate, right? Like really step away and give yourself some clear boundaries from the work. So I only have a few slides left. The last few slides are around team building. And so the first thing I want to do is explain how a committee, like this metaphor of a team, right? So like, let's say we're talking about a baseball team, right? Everybody has a job on the team. And it doesn't mean that you don't step out of your job, right? Like sometimes somebody's running out into the outfield to catch a ball, you might need to cover something, right? And so like, it's totally okay to step into other roles when the team needs you to, but for the most part, you're sticking to your own roles. We need to have clear leadership. Decision making can happen together, but you always need one or sometimes two people. Like sometimes we have co-chairs, right, who are really helping to like a team captain, right, really helping to call the shots, move us forward, tell us when we're taking too long, and move us on in our agenda. What's great about teams is that everybody's different. And that's a good thing. Diversity on teams is really, really important. If everybody was really good at being a batter, but nobody was really good at covering third base, like we would have a problem, right? So it's okay for everybody to be a little bit different. And the important thing about that, and that's the next bullet point here, is that everybody has strengths, and they might be different strengths. Let's key in on what those strengths are. You might talk in a meeting about a project, right? And you might say, who's really good at creating PowerPoint slides? Who's really good at, right? Like you might say, who's really good at leading facilitating a conversation? Who's really good at taking notes, right? So like everybody has a strength. Like let's find out what those are, and we're going to leverage that. It's really important for teams to have a common purpose. It's the same thing for a committee. And so you guys have written a mission and value statement, and that is going to be your common purpose. Everybody has, you're all moving in the same direction because you guys are all united in your core values and your sense of purpose. Whenever an accomplishment happens, you guys are winning together, right? So only one person hit that home run, but guess what? The whole team benefits. It also means that you lose together, right? And sometimes that's where our growth happens the most, is when we make mistakes, when we hit a hiccup. How we handle those challenges together as a team is some of our best moments. Sometimes it's the better moments than winning. And then also we have to manage interpersonal relationships. Teams need to trust each other. Teams need to care about each other. Doesn't mean that you guys are all best friends. That's not what it means. It means that you care about what happens to each other. You care about how the conversation impacts each other. And everybody's got to take accountability, right? You cannot have a strong team if there's always one or two people who are like, not my job, not my interests, not going to do that, right? Everybody needs to take accountability for the work. Elements of a strong team, as I mentioned, having a common goal, innovation, right? Change is good. And I know that that's really hard. And I mentioned before, change happens slowly in committee work. It does. Committee work, sometimes things happen really, really slowly, but it doesn't mean we're not changing. It means we're just taking time to really think through those changes. Each individual member of a team should have a certain level of autonomy and be able to make decisions, right? As I mentioned before, you need clear leadership. Communication is so important. We're going to talk about that again, as I mentioned, next week. And teams need to be collaborative. If you guys are not working together, you're not going to get anything done. How do we get there? So first step is training, which is what we're doing first. The second thing is really about transparency. I have a little window. I thought that was fun. Really being able to lay out on the table, this is what we're doing, this is where we're going, this is what happened last week, and that's why we couldn't get through it, right? And time. It's just going to take time. I have been on committees before where it really takes a couple of years to really get in our groove and really understand what we're doing, and having the right people at the table and things like that. So we talked today about how to establish a safe space with clear rules for engagement and a team mentality, and that is those are the together act as a foundation for a productive group. So what I'm going to do, let me move to my last slide, just where I have my email address. I will leave that up for a moment. And then I'm going to stop the recording so we can have a question and answer.